New York City, the city that never sleeps, buzzed with its usual chaos as the sun dipped below the horizon. The subway system, often called the veins of the metropolis, throbbed with the rhythm of commuters returning home, street performers seeking attention, and the forgotten souls who had nowhere else to go. Among the shadows of the bustling city, a man named Keanu Reeves blended into the crowd. No luxury cars, no entourage. Just Keanu in his usual low-key attire, a dark coat, a beanie, and worn sneakers. He carried a cup of cheap coffee, its warmth cutting through the January chill. Keanu liked the subway. It grounded him. For a man who lived in the world of Hollywood glitz, the rawness of New York's underground reminded him of humanity's real struggles. Tonight, as the fluorescent lights flickered and the smell of hot pretzels and wet concrete filled the air, he took his seat among the masses, a man who craved anonymity but always radiated kindness. At the next stop, the subway car jolted to a brief halt, and in walked a man who immediately shifted the mood of the carriage. A homeless man, disheveled, his layers of mismatched clothing giving him a bulkier appearance. His long, unkempt beard showed hints of frost from the cold outside, and his face was lined with exhaustion and defeat. He carried a battered backpack, the zipper partially broken, and clutched a sign made of cardboard that read, "Hungry. Homeless. Please help." The man shuffled down the center of the car, his eyes scanning the passengers, but few looked up. He softly repeated, "Spare some change? Just $1. Anything helps." His voice carried the weight of someone who had long grown accustomed to rejection. Passengers buried their faces in their phones, their earbuds blocking out the world. Keanu observed the man. Unlike the others, he didn't shrink into his seat. He watched, not out of pity, but with genuine curiosity. There was something in the man's posture, a mixture of pride and vulnerability, that struck Keanu. As the train lurched forward, the man approached a group of teenagers in the corner. They laughed, not in kindness but in mockery. One of them tossed a crumpled dollar at the man's feet and said, "That enough for you, old man?" The homeless man bent down, not out of gratitude but necessity, and picked up the crumpled bill without a word. Keanu's jaw tightened. He hated seeing people reduced to humiliation, especially when life had already dealt them a hard hand. He knew that compassion could be the line between survival and giving up completely. As the man shuffled past Keanu's seat, Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a $50 bill. Not to flaunt wealth, but because he understood that survival required more than spare change. "Sir," Keanu called softly. The man turned, surprised that someone had addressed him respectfully. Keanu extended the $50. "I think you dropped this." His voice was warm but firm, as if he were handing over something the man rightfully owned. The homeless man's eyes widened. "I didn't," he began, his voice cracking. Keanu smiled gently. "It's yours. No strings attached." The man hesitated before accepting the bill, his fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you, man. You don't know what this means." He wiped at his eyes with his sleeve, embarrassed by the emotion bubbling up inside him. "What's your name?" Keanu asked. "Marcus," the man replied, his voice steadier now. "Used to work construction before things fell apart. Been rough for a few years." Keanu nodded, listening as if he had all the time in the world. "I believe it, Marcus. But everyone's got a story worth telling, even if they think no one's listening." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the car as two transit officers entered. Their eyes immediately locked onto Marcus, as if they had been trained to detect anyone who didn't fit the mold of a typical commuter. "Sir," one officer barked, "no panhandling allowed. Let's go." Marcus' shoulders slumped as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. He stepped forward, complying without argument. "Hold on a second," Keanu interjected, his voice cutting through the tension. The officers turned to face him, their eyes narrowing. "And who are you?" one asked. "Someone who's just having a conversation," Keanu replied calmly, standing from his seat. His height made him tower slightly over the officers, but his demeanor was anything but confrontational. "He's not causing any trouble," Keanu continued. "He's just trying to survive like the rest of us. Isn't the point of this city to help each other out?" One officer scoffed. Rules are rules. Keanu smiled faintly, his gaze unwavering. And sometimes, kindness bends the rules when the rules forget to be human. The second officer hesitated. He recognized the man speaking, not just as a movie star, but as someone who carried an air of authenticity. The kind of person whose words felt genuine. "He's not hurting anyone," Keanu said softly. "Let him be." After a moment of silence, the first officer sighed, clearly reluctant. "Fine, but if we see him again, he's out." They turned and left through the sliding doors, their heavy boots fading into the distance. Marcus stood frozen, the adrenaline from the encounter still pumping through his veins. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. Keanu placed a hand on Marcus' shoulder. "You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you won't give up." Marcus nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As the train pulled into the next station, Keanu helped Marcus gather his belongings and led him off the subway car. "Let's get you a hot meal first," Keanu said, steering him toward the nearest diner. "Then we'll figure out the rest." Marcus glanced at him, a flicker of hope returning to his tired eyes. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a problem to be dealt with, but as a human being worthy of kindness. And so, in the midst of New York City's chaotic subway system, a small act of compassion sparked something larger. Keanu Reeves wasn't just an actor in this moment. He was a reminder that kindness could exist anywhere, even in the forgotten corners of the world. As the subway rumbled forward, the hum of fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a cold, sterile glow over the nearly empty train car. Keanu kept his gaze soft and steady, blending seamlessly into the backdrop of New York's usual chaos. To anyone else, he was just another passenger, a man in a weathered coat and well-worn boots, eyes slightly glazed from what seemed like another long day. But as his gaze scanned the car, he noticed something out of the ordinary. A man slouched across a row of seats at the far end. The man's clothes were mismatched and tattered, his coat hanging off his frame like a discarded blanket. His shoes, held together by frayed duct tape, had holes near the soles, exposing his bare toes to the chilly air. His matted hair spilled onto his face, partially hiding the deep lines of hardship that etched his features. A tattered backpack sat at his feet, its zipper barely functional, with a few crumpled possessions spilling out. His head was bowed, arms folded over his stomach, as if trying to shield himself from the world. To most, he was invisible, just another homeless man, part of the urban backdrop people hurried past without a second thought. But to Keanu, there was something arresting about him. Perhaps it was the way his fingers trembled, or the quiet sniffle that occasionally escaped him. Maybe it was the way he clutched his sides, as though the weight of the world had pressed him into that very seat, leaving him trapped. The subway car was mostly empty, save for a businessman scrolling on his phone and a middle-aged woman nodding off near the exit. Keanu stood quietly for a moment, debating whether he should approach. Would it be seen as intrusive? Would the man reject his kindness, too proud to accept help? Just as Keanu took a step forward, the man let out a soft groan, shifting in his seat. He clutched his stomach tighter, his face contorting briefly in pain. Keanu's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just exhaustion or cold. Something was wrong. Without hesitation, Keanu crossed the car and knelt down beside the man. "Hey," he said softly, his voice calm and steady. "You okay, man?" The man stirred, lifting his head slightly. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, met Keanu's gaze for a fleeting second before darting away, as if ashamed to be seen. He wiped his nose with the sleeve of his jacket and muttered something under his breath. "What's that?" Keanu asked, leaning in slightly. "I'm fine," the man croaked, though his voice betrayed him. It was raspy and strained, like someone who hadn't had a proper meal or drink in days. He tried to shift away, but Keanu stayed rooted, his gaze unwavering. "You don't look fine," Keanu said gently. "When's the last time you ate?" The man hesitated, his lips parting as if to answer, but no words came. His hands trembled again, and Keanu's eyes followed the movement, noting the pale, almost bluish tint to his fingers. He was freezing. Keanu reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a protein bar he had stashed earlier in the day. "Here," he said, offering it. "It's not much, but it'll help." The man stared at the bar, hesitant. His pride, bruised and battered as it was, seemed to battle against his hunger. "I don't need charity," he whispered, his voice cracking. "This isn't charity," Keanu replied, a warm smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's survival." After a long pause, the man finally reached out, his fingers brushing against Keanu's as he took the bar. He unwrapped it slowly, as if savoring the smell before taking a cautious bite. As he chewed, Keanu sat down on the floor beside him, resting his back against the cold metal wall of the subway car. "What's your name?" Keanu asked after a moment. The man swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly as he processed the food. "Daryl," he mumbled. "I'm Keanu," came the gentle reply. No mention of who he was, no need to introduce himself as a celebrity. Just Keanu, a fellow human being. Daryl nodded, but didn't say anything further. His gaze drifted toward the subway window, where the dimly lit tunnels blurred past like a forgotten dream. For a while, the two sat in comfortable silence, broken only by the distant hum of the train. Then, Daryl spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a rough few weeks." Keanu turned his head slightly, giving Daryl his full attention. "What happened?" Daryl let out a long sigh, his breath fogging up the window beside him. "Lost my job, then my apartment. It all just spiraled. I had a place in the Bronx, but rent kept going up and work hours kept getting cut. Before I knew it, I was out on the street." Keanu listened without interrupting, letting the man unload his burdens without judgment. He could hear the exhaustion in Daryl's voice, the weight of someone who had been fighting for far too long without a break. "I tried to get into a shelter," Daryl continued, "but they're packed. Lines are long, and I don't have the patience some nights. So, I just find a spot to crash. Usually here on the subway." Keanu nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. How easy it was to fall through the cracks in a city like this. He thought about how many people like Daryl were one stroke of bad luck away from losing everything. The subway car rocked gently as it sped through the tunnels beneath New York City, the rhythmic clanking of the tracks providing a backdrop to Daryl's story. Keanu sat quietly, allowing the man to continue speaking, knowing that sometimes just being heard was its own form of healing. "I wasn't always like this," Daryl said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the train. "Had a good job, worked in a warehouse. Nights were hard, but I could manage. Then they downsized, so they didn't need as many of us anymore." He laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "I thought I'd bounce back. Just needed a few weeks, maybe a month, to find something new. But then, one thing after another." Keanu nodded, his expression empathetic. He knew how fragile life could be, how easily someone could be knocked off their feet and struggle to stand again. And yet, here Daryl was surviving, even if barely. "Do you have any family?" Keanu asked gently. Daryl shrugged. "Not really. My mom passed a few years ago. Dad's been gone longer than I can remember. Had a sister, but we lost touch. She's got her own life, somewhere upstate. I don't want to drag her into my mess." Keanu's gaze softened. He had heard that kind of pride before, the kind that kept people from reaching out even when they desperately needed a hand. "You're not a mess," Keanu said softly. "You're human." Daryl chuckled, though it sounded more like a sigh. "Doesn't feel that way when you're sleeping on train seats and digging through garbage for food." Keanu let the silence sit for a moment before speaking again. "I know it feels like the world's forgotten you, like you're invisible, but you're not. I see you, Daryl, and you're worth more than this." Daryl blinked, his gaze darting toward Keanu, as if searching his face for signs of pity or condescension. But there was none, just warmth, just sincerity. The train began to slow, its brakes screeching as it approached the next station. The woman who had been dozing near the exit gathered her things and shuffled off the train, leaving them nearly alone in the car. The doors hissed shut, and the subway lurched forward once more. "You ever wonder how it got this bad?" Daryl asked, breaking the silence. "How we live in a city with so much wealth, so many people walking around with designer shoes and fancy bags, and yet guys like me are just left behind." Keanu sighed, his fingers tracing a small crease on the sleeve of his coat. "I do. All the time. It's not right. And it shouldn't be this way." He paused, choosing his words carefully. But just because the world's broken doesn't mean you have to be. Daryl seemed to chew on that thought for a moment, his lips pressing into a thin line. "How'd you end up here?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward Keanu's simple appearance. "You don't look like the kind of guy who takes the subway at this hour." Keanu smiled faintly. "I like the subway. Keeps me grounded. Reminds me of what's real." He hesitated before continuing. "I know I'm fortunate. But no matter where life takes me, I try not to forget what it's like to struggle." Daryl gave him a curious look. "You ever have it rough?" Keanu's gaze flickered downward, as if he were momentarily lost in memory. "Yet I've had my share of loss. My dad left when I was young. Lost a close friend. Lost my partner. There were days I didn't think I'd make it through." His voice softened. "But the thing about pain is, it teaches you empathy. Or at least, it should." Daryl nodded, understanding that pain wasn't a competition. It didn't matter if someone's struggle looked different on the surface. It could be just as heavy to carry. Keanu shifted slightly and reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Daryl, who opened it cautiously. Inside was the address of a local shelter and a handwritten note. "Tell them you spoke to Keanu." "I know it's not much," Keanu said, "but I know some people there. They can help you get a warm place to sleep tonight and maybe a path forward." Daryl stared at the paper for a long moment, his fingers tracing the inked letters as if they were written in gold. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "I know," Keanu replied, "but I want to." For a second, Daryl's eyes glossed over, and he quickly wiped them with the sleeve of his coat. "People don't do this kind of thing anymore. Maybe not enough people," Keanu said, "but it starts with one." The subway slowed again as it approached the next station. The lights outside the window flickered, casting ghostly shadows across the car. The automated voice announced the stop, and Keanu knew it was time to leave. He stood and adjusted his coat before looking down at Daryl one last time. "You're stronger than you think, Daryl. You got through today, and you'll get through tomorrow." Daryl swallowed hard and nodded. "Thanks, man, for seeing me." Keanu smiled softly. "Always." As the subway doors opened, Keanu stepped onto the platform, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. He shoved his hands into his pockets and walked toward the stairs, blending seamlessly into the sea of passengers moving in every direction. Back on the subway, Daryl sat quietly, the folded paper clutched tightly in his hand. He exhaled deeply, as though letting go of a weight he'd carried for far too long. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, and somewhere in the labyrinth of New York's subway system, a man who refused to be recognized as a hero had just changed a life with nothing more than a conversation and a small act of kindness. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the cracks of the city's towering buildings. Casting long shadows across the streets of New York, the hustle and bustle had already begun. Taxis honking, vendors shouting, and the rhythmic hum of footsteps echoing against the pavement. But for Daryl, the world felt quieter than usual, as though time had slowed down just enough for him to appreciate where he was. He stood outside the shelter that Keanu had directed him to, clutching the folded paper like it was a ticket to something bigger. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from a combination of hope and fear. Hope that this was the start of something new, and fear that it might not be. Daryl took a deep breath, stepped through the glass doors, and approached the front desk. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile looked up from her computer. "How can I help you?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment, then unfolded the paper and placed it on the counter. "Keanu told me to give you this." Her eyebrows lifted slightly at the name, and her expression softened even more. "Ah," she said, nodding as though she understood everything without needing further explanation. "You're in the right place. Let's get you settled." Within an hour, Daryl found himself sitting on a clean bed in a shared room. His body sank into the mattress, and he let out a long sigh, the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to ease. For the first time in weeks, he didn't have to worry about where he'd sleep or whether he'd be kicked off a train in the middle of the night. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The shelter provided him with new clothes, a hot meal, and something even more valuable, a caseworker who listened to him, much like Keanu had the night before. Together, they mapped out a plan, resume building, job applications, and counseling sessions to help him rebuild the life he had lost piece by piece. As the days turned into weeks, Daryl slowly began to regain his sense of self. He found part-time work at a nearby warehouse, and though it wasn't glamorous, it was a step in the right direction. With each shift, he felt a little stronger, a little more like the man he used to be before life had thrown him off course. But Daryl's transformation wasn't the only ripple caused by that night on the subway. Underscore 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 across town. A commuter who had been sitting a few seats away from Keanu and Daryl couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. His name was Tom, a corporate executive who rarely paid attention to anything beyond the screen of his phone during his subway rides. But that night had been different. He had seen Keanu sit down with a homeless man, not out of obligation or pity, but out of genuine compassion. The image replayed in his mind as he commuted to work the next day. He couldn't shake the thought. If someone like Keanu Reeves, a world-famous celebrity, could take the time to care about a stranger, then why couldn't he? The thought nagged at him until he finally did something he had never done before. He stopped at a nearby cafe and bought an extra cup of coffee. On his way to the office, he handed the coffee to a man sitting on the sidewalk with a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Anything helps?" The man's eyes lit up with gratitude, and for the first time in a long time, Tom felt something he couldn't explain, a sense of purpose beyond his usual routine. The following week, Tom volunteered at a local soup kitchen. What started as a single act of kindness soon became a regular part of his life. And though he never knew Daryl's name or the full story of that night on the subway, he carried the memory with him, a reminder that kindness could be contagious. Underscore 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 underscore. Meanwhile, another ripple had spread to a young woman named Rachel, who had been scrolling through her phone when she noticed someone discreetly recording Keanu and Daryl's interaction. The video wasn't flashy or staged. It captured the rawness of the moment. Keanu sitting cross-legged, listening intently as Daryl shared his struggles. Rachel shared the video on her social media account with a caption that read, "This is what humanity looks like." Within hours, the post gained traction, accumulating thousands of likes, comments, and shares. People from around the world watched the video, many leaving comments about how it had inspired them to do something kind for someone else. Donations to local shelters spiked in the following days, as did volunteer signups. Rachel didn't expect the video to go viral, but she was glad it did. It reminded her of the power of storytelling and how one seemingly small moment could inspire change on a larger scale. Underscore 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 back at the shelter. Daryl's life continued to improve. He had saved enough money to rent a small studio apartment. Nothing fancy, but it was his. The first night in his new home, he sat on the floor since he didn't have much furniture yet, and ate takeout while reflecting on how much had changed. He thought about Keanu's words, "Just because the world's broken doesn't mean you have to be." Those words had become a mantra, something he repeated to himself whenever doubt crept in. They reminded him that even when things seemed impossible, there was always a way forward. The next morning, Daryl did something he hadn't done in years. He called his sister. They talked for hours, catching up on everything they had missed. She cried when he told her about the shelter and the job, and by the end of the call, they had made plans to meet in person. For Daryl, reconnecting with family was another step toward healing. It reminded him that he didn't have to go through life alone, that it was okay to ask for help and lean on others when needed. Underscore. Months later, Daryl found himself back on the subway, but this time, he wasn't riding aimlessly. He had a purpose. Dressed in a clean button-up shirt and jeans, he carried a small backpack filled with sandwiches, water bottles, and hygiene kits he had prepared for others who might be in the same situation he had once been. He approached a man sitting on a bench, his head bowed low. Daryl sat down beside him and offered a sandwich. The man looked up, surprised, and accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you." They talked for a while, just as Keanu had done with him. And as Daryl listened to the man's story, he realized that kindness wasn't just something you received, it was something you passed on. The train rattled forward, carrying them through the heart of the city, where millions of lives intersected every day. Some encounters were fleeting, while others left a mark that could last a lifetime. For Daryl, that night with Keanu had been the latter. It had reminded him of the power of connection and the importance of being seen. And now, he was ready to be that person for someone else. The ripples continued. Several months passed, and the city moved forward as it always did, bustling and relentless. Winter turned to spring, and with the changing seasons, Daryl's life transformed as well. His small studio apartment was now furnished, albeit modestly, with a couch, a second-hand table, and a small bookshelf filled with self-help books and novels. His job at the warehouse had turned into something more stable, and he had even started working part-time at a local community center, helping others find the resources they needed to get back on their feet. Daryl had become the person he had once desperately needed. And yet, he couldn't shake the thought of Keanu, the man who had changed his life with a simple conversation on a subway. Every now and then, he wondered if he'd ever get the chance to thank him again. He wanted to tell Keanu about everything: the job, the apartment, the newfound purpose. But New York was a big city, and the odds of their paths crossing again seemed slim. Until fate had its say. Underscore, 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 underscore. It was a warm afternoon when Daryl found himself back on the subway, heading to a volunteer shift at the community center. The train wasn't as crowded as usual, and he managed to find a seat by the window. He put on his headphones and let the rhythmic clatter of the train blend into the music playing in his ears. At the next stop, the doors slid open, and a new wave of passengers boarded. Daryl barely looked up until he noticed a familiar figure standing just a few feet away, leaning against one of the poles. His heart skipped a beat. It was Keanu. He looked the same as he had that night, casually dressed, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, trying to blend in. But to Daryl, he was unmistakable. His mind raced as he debated what to do. Should he say something? What if Keanu didn't remember him? What if this moment, which meant so much to Daryl, was just a passing memory to someone like Keanu? But then he thought about what Keanu had told him that night. Just because the world's broken doesn't mean you have to be. With that thought in mind, Daryl took a deep breath, stood up, and crossed the short distance between them. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. Keanu looked up, removing his sunglasses slightly to get a better look. For a second, he seemed confused, but then recognition flashed across his face. "Daryl?" Daryl smiled, relief washing over him. "Yeah, it's me." Keanu's expression softened into a warm smile, and he gestured to the seat beside him. "Sit down, man. Tell me how you've been." Daryl sat, and for the next several minutes, he poured out everything: the shelter, the job, the apartment, the community center, and the people he had helped along the way. As he spoke, Keanu listened intently, just as he had done that night on the subway. "I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for you," Daryl admitted, his voice catching slightly. "You didn't just give me advice. You made me believe that things could get better." Keanu nodded slowly. "Sometimes, all it takes is someone to remind you of your worth." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the train rattling around them. The city outside the window blurred into streaks of light, but inside that subway car, time felt suspended. "I'm proud of you," Keanu said finally. "You did the hard part. I just sat with you for a while." Daryl chuckled. "You make it sound like it was nothing. But to me, it was everything." Keanu leaned back slightly, his gaze thoughtful. "That's the thing about kindness. You never know how far it'll go. You just put it out there and hope it makes a difference." As the train pulled into the next station, Daryl felt a sense of closure. Not because their story was ending, but because it had come full circle. He had taken Keanu's kindness and turned it into something that could keep growing, affecting others just like it had affected him. "I'm heading to the community center," Daryl said as he stood. "If you're ever free, you should stop by." Keanu nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I might just do that." The train doors slid open, and Daryl stepped onto the platform, turning back one last time to wave. Keanu waved back, and just like that, the doors closed, and the train whisked him away. A few days later, Daryl was working the front desk at the community center when the door opened, and in walked a man wearing a familiar baseball cap and sunglasses. The volunteers around him froze, whispering among themselves as they recognized the movie star standing in their midst. But Daryl didn't see a celebrity. He saw the man who had given him a second chance when he needed it most. "Keanu," he said, grinning as he approached him. "I didn't think you'd actually come." Keanu shrugged playfully. "I had some time to kill." Daryl laughed, and together, they toured the center. Keanu met the volunteers, shook hands with the staff, and listened to the stories of the people who had found hope within those walls. He didn't act like a guest of honor or someone seeking attention. He simply listened, much like he had done with Daryl that night. Before he left, Keanu pulled Daryl aside and handed him a small notebook. "I write down thoughts sometimes," he explained. "Quotes, things I've learned over the years. I think you'll appreciate some of them." Daryl accepted the notebook with a nod, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Thanks, Keanu, for everything." As Keanu walked out the door, Daryl knew that this wasn't the end of their connection. The lessons he had learned from that night would continue to guide him, not just in his own life, but in the lives of the people he would go on to help. And so, the ripples kept expanding, touching lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. Because sometimes a single act of kindness wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. A week later, Daryl sat in his small but cozy apartment, flipping through the notebook Keanu had given him. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, quotes, and thoughts, each one carefully penned. Some were Keanu's own reflections, while others were words he had gathered over the years, offering wisdom and insight. One quote, in particular, stood out to Daryl. "The smallest act of kindness is worth more than the grandest intention." Oscar Wilde leaned back on the worn-out couch, closing the notebook for a moment to reflect on those words. Keanu's impact on his life had been exactly that, an act of kindness, quiet and unassuming, but powerful enough to change the course of his future. And now, Daryl realized he had the opportunity to create similar ripples. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Clara, one of the volunteers at the community center. "Hey, we got a guy who just came in. Lost his job and his home. Could use some support. Are you free to come by?" Daryl quickly replied, "On my way." Underscore, 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 underscore. When he arrived at the community center, the air inside was warm and familiar, filled with the faint hum of conversations and the occasional laugh from kids playing in the activity room. Clara greeted him at the door, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "He's in the lounge," she said, nodding toward a room at the back. "His name's Marcus. Been living on the streets for a few weeks. Says he used to work construction but got injured and couldn't keep up with the physical labor." Daryl nodded, taking it all in. He had been Marcus not long ago, lost, hopeless, and unsure of how to rebuild his life. The thought filled him with empathy, but it also gave him purpose. He knew what Marcus needed wasn't just resources, but someone who understood. He stepped into the lounge and found Marcus sitting on a worn couch, hunched over, his hands clasped together as he stared at the floor. He looked up when Daryl entered, his eyes guarded but curious. "Hey, Marcus," Daryl said with a warm smile. "I'm Daryl. Clara told me a bit about your situation. Mind if I sit?" Marcus shrugged. "Go ahead." Daryl sat down beside him, leaving a comfortable space between them. "I know what it's like," he said gently. "A few months ago, I was in your shoes. No job, no place to stay. Thought things couldn't get any worse." Marcus's brow furrowed. "How'd you turn it around?" Daryl smiled, the memory of that night on the subway flashing through his mind. "It started with someone who believed in me. A stranger who reminded me that even when everything feels broken, you don't have to be." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "I'm not saying it's easy. It's not. But you've already taken the first step by coming here. That takes courage." Marcus exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Yeah, I guess." Daryl leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We can help you find a place to stay, get you in touch with job programs. But more than that, we're here to listen, to remind you that you're not alone in this." For the first time since Daryl entered the room, Marcus's expression softened. "Thanks, man. I didn't think anyone would care." "I get it," Daryl said. "I didn't think anyone would care either. But someone did. And now, I get to pass that on to you." Underscore, 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 underscore. Underscore, 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 underscore. Over the next few days, Daryl worked closely with Marcus, helping him fill out job applications, apply for temporary housing, and schedule an appointment with a physical therapist who could help with his injury. Slowly but surely, Marcus began to see a light at the end of the tunnel. And with each small victory, Daryl felt a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as they were wrapping up a meeting at the center, Marcus turned to Daryl and said, "You know, I don't think I've ever had anyone believe in me the way you do." Daryl smiled, patting him on the shoulder. "It's because I know you're capable of more than you think." Marcus nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I'm gonna make it. I can feel it." Underscore, 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 underscore. A few weeks later, Daryl received a text from Marcus. "Got the job. Starting next week. Thanks for everything." He grinned, replying with a simple, "Proud of you. Keep going." That night, as he lay in bed, Daryl thought about the chain of events that had brought him here. Keanu's words on that subway had sparked something within him, and now that spark had been passed on to Marcus. And maybe, one day, Marcus would pass it on to someone else. The ripple effect continued. Underscore, 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 underscore. One afternoon, Daryl received a package at the community center. The return address was unfamiliar, but when he opened it, he found a handwritten note from Keanu, along with a small, framed quote. "The world changes by your example, not your opinion." Paulo Coelho, the note read, "Daryl, keep being the example the world needs. You're doing amazing things." Daryl felt a lump form in his throat as he read the words. He placed the frame on the wall of his office, where it would serve as a daily reminder of the power of kindness and the importance of paying it forward. As he stepped out into the main hall of the center, he heard the laughter of kids playing, the hum of volunteers chatting, and the hopeful voices of those seeking a fresh start. And in that moment, Daryl realized something profound. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. And it was all thanks to a stranger on a subway who had reminded him that even when the world feels broken, kindness can still heal. Because sometimes it's the quiet, unspoken moments that create the loudest impact. A few years passed, and life kept moving forward. Daryl had grown into a key figure at the community center, known not just for his dedication, but for his unique ability to connect with people. His story became an inspiration to others, a living testament to the idea that a single act of kindness could change a life. He had helped dozens of people find their footing again, people who had once felt invisible and discarded, much like he had. And every time he saw them succeed, it reminded him of how far he had come and how much further he could go. Underscore 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 one crisp autumn morning. Daryl was sipping coffee in the small cafe near the community center when his phone buzzed with a reminder about a local charity gala happening that evening. The community center had received an invitation, and Daryl, as one of its leaders, had been asked to attend. Normally, he would have preferred to stay behind the scenes, letting someone else take the spotlight. But this time he felt compelled to go. Maybe it was the season, or maybe it was the quiet voice inside him, reminding him that he owed it to himself to celebrate how far he'd come. That evening, Daryl put on his best suit, a simple but well-fitting one that Clara had helped him pick out months ago when he had his first television interview about the center. As he arrived at the elegant venue, the sounds of soft jazz filled the air, and the warm glow of chandeliers illuminated the room. He took a moment to take it all in. Just a few years ago, he had been sitting on a cold subway bench, unsure of where his next meal would come from. Now he was here, representing an organization that was changing lives. Underscore 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 as the night went on. Daryl mingled with donors, local politicians, and fellow community leaders. He shared stories of the people the center had helped, and each conversation reinforced his gratitude for the journey he had taken. Toward the end of the night, while waiting in line at the dessert table, Daryl felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around and nearly dropped his plate when he saw who it was. Keanu? His voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the soft music. Keanu Reeves stood there, dressed in a tailored black suit, his signature kind smile lighting up his face. Daryl, right? Daryl blinked, still processing the moment. You remember me? Keanu chuckled. Of course I do. We had a pretty memorable night on the subway. A wave of emotions crashed over Daryl. Gratitude, disbelief, and a sense of full-circle closure. I can't believe this, he said, shaking his head. I've thought about that night so many times. It changed everything for me. Keanu's gaze softened, and he gestured for them to step away from the crowd to a quieter corner of the room. I heard about what you've been doing, he said. The community center, the people you've helped. It's incredible. Daryl felt a lump in his throat. It's all because of you. If you hadn't stopped that night, I don't know where I'd be. Keanu shook his head gently. You give me too much credit. You were the one who chose to get up and fight. I just gave you a nudge. Daryl laughed, a warm, genuine sound. A pretty powerful nudge. They sat down at a nearby table, where Keanu listened intently as Daryl recounted the years that followed their subway encounter. Finding the community center, helping Marcus, and eventually leading the organization. As Daryl spoke, Keanu nodded thoughtfully, occasionally interjecting with questions and words of encouragement. When Daryl finished, Keanu leaned back in his chair, a contemplative look in his eyes. You've created something amazing, he said. And the best part? You're not just changing lives, you're creating a legacy. Every person you've helped is going to go out and help someone else. Daryl felt tears welling in his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. I still think about what you said that night. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to believe in you. I try to be that person for others now. Keanu smiled, his gaze warm. And you've done that, Daryl. More than you know. Underscore 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 as the gala began to wind down. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card. Here's my personal number, he said, handing it to Daryl. If you ever need anything, advice, resources, or just someone to talk to, don't hesitate to reach out. Daryl accepted the card, his hands trembling slightly. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You've already said it by living the life you've built. Just keep doing what you're doing. They stood up, and Keanu pulled Daryl into a brief, heartfelt hug. You're the hero of this story, he said softly. Never forget that. Daryl watched as Keanu walked away, disappearing into the crowd. For a moment, he stood there, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Then, with renewed determination, he slipped the card into his pocket and headed for the exit. The night air was crisp, and as Daryl walked back to his apartment, he couldn't help but smile. He had come full circle, but he knew this wasn't the end of his journey. It was only the beginning of something bigger. Because sometimes, life gives you moments that feel like endings, but they're really just the start of a new chapter. And Daryl was ready to keep writing his story, one act of kindness at a time. The days following the gala were a whirlwind for Daryl. The interaction with Keanu had been surreal, a reminder of how far he had come, but also an acknowledgement of how much more there was to do. With renewed focus, Daryl returned to the community center, motivated to expand its reach and impact. But something else had shifted within him after that night. He wasn't just thinking about helping individuals anymore. He was thinking bigger. How could he change the system that left people like him behind? How could he address not just the symptoms of homelessness and poverty, but the root causes? One afternoon, as he sat in his small office overlooking the busy street outside, Clara knocked on the door, peeking her head in. "You've got a visitor," she said with a knowing smile. Daryl raised an eyebrow. "Who is it?" "Someone who says you saved his life," Clara replied before stepping aside to reveal Marcus. Daryl stood up, his face lighting up with joy. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" Marcus, now 17 and looking more confident than ever, entered the office with a wide grin. "I came to tell you some good news," he said, holding up an acceptance letter. "I got into college." Daryl felt a surge of pride, his throat tightening with emotion. "That's amazing, Marcus. I'm so proud of you." "Couldn't have done it without you," Marcus said, taking a seat across from Daryl's desk. "You were the first person who believed in me, who told me I could be more than my circumstances." Daryl shook his head. "You did the work, Marcus. I just gave you the space to see your own potential." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "I want to be like you, Daryl. I want to help people the way you helped me." The weight of those words settled over Daryl like a warm blanket. "Then you will," he said confidently. "But you'll do it your way. Take what you've learned here and make it your own." They talked for hours, discussing Marcus's plans for the future and how he could use his education to give back to the community. By the time Marcus left, Daryl felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced before. This was it. This was the legacy Keanu had talked about, the ripple effect of kindness, passing from one person to the next, creating waves of change. Underscore 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 underscore. A few months later, Daryl received an unexpected invitation to speak at a national conference on homelessness and social reform. Initially, he was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and the idea of standing in front of hundreds of people made his palms sweat. But Clara wouldn't let him back out. "This is your moment, Daryl," she said, crossing her arms firmly. "You've been given this platform for a reason. You need to share your story because it can inspire others to create change." With her encouragement and a brief text exchange with Keanu, who responded with a simple yet motivating, "You've got this," Daryl agreed to attend. Underscore 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 underscore. On the day of the conference, Daryl stood backstage, adjusting his tie and taking deep breaths to calm his nerves. The MC introduced him, and as the applause echoed through the auditorium, he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding him. He scanned the audience, policymakers, nonprofit leaders, activists, all waiting to hear what he had to say. Daryl gripped the sides of the podium and began. "I'm not here because I have all the answers," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves swirling inside him. "I'm here because I've lived the questions. I know what it's like to sleep on a cold bench, to feel invisible, to believe that your life doesn't matter. But I also know what it's like when someone reaches out and shows you that you do matter." He told the story of the subway encounter, of how Keanu Reeves had stepped in at a moment when he was ready to give up. He described the transformation that followed, the people he had met, and the lessons he had learned along the way. But this isn't a story about me, Daryl continued. It's a story about what happens when we decide to see people as more than their circumstances. When we look beyond the label society puts on them and see their potential instead. I'm standing here today because someone believed in me, and now it's my job to pass that belief on to others. The room was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence born from disinterest. It was the kind of silence that meant people were listening, absorbing, and understanding. As Daryl wrapped up his speech, he left the audience with a challenge. If we want real change, it can't just be about individual acts of kindness. Those are important, yes, but we need to create systems that lift people up instead of holding them down. We need policies that prioritize compassion and equity. We need communities where no one is left behind. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Daryl didn't revel in it. Instead, he thought about the work still left to do. Underscore, 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 underscore later that evening. As he sat in his hotel room scrolling through messages of support and praise, his phone buzzed with a new text. Keanu saw the clip. Proud of you. You're making a difference. Daryl smiled, his fingers hovering over the keyboard before he typed his response. Daryl, couldn't have done it without you. Keanu, you did the real work. I just gave you a nudge. As Daryl set his phone down, he realized that those words had come full circle. Just as Keanu had once given him a nudge, he had now passed that same encouragement on to Marcus and countless others. And it wasn't going to stop there, because every act of kindness, no matter how small, had the potential to grow into something greater. One person could inspire another, and that person could inspire a movement. Daryl was living proof of that. And as he closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, he knew that the ripple effect had only just begun. A year later, Daryl stood at the entrance of a newly built homeless resource center, the ribbon in front of him gleaming under the midday sun. The building was more than just a shelter. It was a comprehensive hub for job training, mental health services, addiction recovery, and long-term housing support. The culmination of years of hard work, donations, and partnerships had made this moment possible. Standing beside him was Marcus, now a first-year social work major at a nearby university. Clara, who had played a pivotal role in the center's development, smiled proudly as she handed Daryl the ceremonial scissors. I can't believe this is happening, Daryl said, shaking his head in disbelief. Believe it, Clara replied. You earned this. A crowd of reporters, community members, and local leaders gathered around, applauding as Daryl cut the ribbon. As the crowd dispersed into the building for a tour, Marcus nudged Daryl's shoulder. Hey, guess who showed up? Marcus pointed toward the entrance. Daryl squinted through the sunlight, and his heart skipped a beat. Walking toward him, wearing a simple black jacket and jeans, was Keanu Reeves. He smiled warmly and offered a wave as he approached. Keanu, Daryl said, unable to hide his excitement. You came. Of course, Keanu replied, pulling Daryl into a brief hug. I wouldn't miss this for the world. Marcus, grinning ear to ear, extended his hand. You're a legend, man. Thank you for what you did for Daryl back then. Keanu chuckled, shaking Marcus's hand. Daryl's the real legend. I just happened to be on the right train that day. The three of them walked into the center, where Daryl gave Keanu a personal tour. He showed him the job training rooms, the dormitories for long-term residents, and the recreational spaces where people could feel safe and supported. Every detail of the center had been carefully planned to provide dignity and hope to those who walked through its doors. When they reached the community garden on the rooftop, Keanu paused to take in the view of the city skyline. This is incredible, Keanu said, his gaze shifting to Daryl. I knew you'd do something special. But this is beyond what I imagined. Daryl leaned against the railing, looking out over the city. I wouldn't be here without you. You were the first person who reminded me I had value. You saw me when no one else did. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes that's all it takes, a moment when someone sees you for who you are, not what you're going through. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Daryl broke the silence with a chuckle. You know, he said, I used to think that moment on the subway was just luck. But now I think it was meant to happen. You were meant to be there. Keanu smiled. Maybe. Or maybe the world just needs more people willing to step up when it counts. As they walked back toward the main hall, they were greeted by Clara, who handed Daryl a microphone. Time for your speech, she said, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Daryl's hands trembled slightly as he stepped up to the podium. The room quieted as he adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. I never thought I'd be standing here, he began. When I was living on the streets, I didn't think I had a future. I didn't think anyone cared if I lived or died. But one person did. One person saw me and reminded me that I was worth saving. He glanced at Keanu, who stood near the back of the room, giving him a supportive nod. That act of kindness changed my life, Daryl continued. And that's why this center exists. Because I believe we can all be that person for someone else. We can all be the reason someone finds hope when they've lost it. He took a deep breath, his voice steady. This isn't just a building. It's a promise. A promise that no matter how hard life gets, no one has to go through it alone. We're here to lift each other up, to remind each other that we matter. The room erupted in applause, and Daryl felt tears welling in his eyes. As he stepped down from the podium, Marcus and Clara were the first to greet him, both wrapping him in a group hug. Keanu approached next, shaking his hand firmly. You've built something amazing, Daryl. I'm proud of you. Thank you, Daryl said, his voice thick with emotion. But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. Underscore. Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the center had settled into its first night of operation, Daryl sat on a bench outside, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Keanu joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee he had picked up from a nearby cafe. You really stayed true to your vision, Keanu said, handing Daryl one of the cups. Daryl took a sip, savoring the warmth. I couldn't have done it without the people around me. Clara, Marcus, and others, they're all part of this. Keanu tilted his head. That's the beauty of it. One act of kindness can inspire an entire community. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the hum of traffic filling the background. Then, Keanu broke the silence with a thoughtful question. What's next for you? Daryl smiled, gazing up at the night sky. More centers, hopefully. I want this to be a model for other cities. If we could do this here, we could do it anywhere. Keanu nodded approvingly. Let me know how I can help. Daryl chuckled. Haven't you done enough? Keanu shook his head. There's always more to do. As they finished their coffee, Daryl couldn't help but think about how far he had come. From a homeless man on a subway platform to the founder of a life-changing community center. It had been a journey filled with challenges, but every obstacle had led him to this moment. And it all started with a simple act of kindness on a subway. Keanu stood, stretching slightly. I should get going, but I'll be back to check in. Daryl stood as well, extending his hand. Thank you for everything. Keanu shook his hand firmly. You don't need to thank me anymore. You've taken that kindness and multiplied it. That's the real reward. As Keanu walked away, disappearing into the night, Daryl felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just living a new life. He was helping others find theirs. Because in the end, kindness wasn't just an action. It was a legacy, and Daryl was determined to pass it on. The ripple had turned into a wave, and it wasn't slowing down. Weeks passed, and the Daryl Monroe Community Center, as it was now officially named, became a beacon of hope for people in need across New York City. People came not only for shelter, but for opportunities, job placement programs, therapy sessions, GED classes, and more. Every day, Daryl saw faces filled with fear turn into ones filled with hope. For every person the center helped, Daryl felt as though he was repaying the kindness Keanu had shown him. But what Daryl didn't realize was that his story, and Keanu's small act of kindness, was traveling far beyond the walls of the center. The social media storm one afternoon. Daryl sat at his desk, catching up on paperwork when Marcus barged into his office, phone in hand and a wide grin on his face. Daryl, have you seen this? Marcus asked, practically shoving the phone at him. Daryl squinted at the screen. It was a post from a popular news site with the headline, "How One Act of Kindness from Keanu Reeves Changed a Life and an Entire Community." Beneath it was a photo of Daryl and Keanu at the community center's ribbon-cutting ceremony. His heart pounded as he skimmed through the article, which detailed their subway encounter, the journey to building the center, and how it had helped over 200 people find jobs or permanent housing in just a few short months. "This is insane," Daryl muttered. "How'd they even find out about this?" Marcus shrugged. "Probably someone who works here tipped them off. But that's not all." He refreshed the page and showed Daryl the comment section, which was flooded with messages from people around the world. "This is the kind of story we need right now. Restores my faith in humanity. I'm not crying, you're crying. I've always known Keanu Reeves was a legend, but Daryl Monroe? Now that's a hero too. Does this center accept donations? I want to help." Daryl set the phone down, his mind racing. "Donations?" Marcus grinned. "Oh yeah. There's a link to our donation page at the bottom of the article. Guess how much we've raised since this morning?" Daryl could hardly breathe as Marcus held up his phone with the total, $150,000. "No way," Daryl whispered, leaning back in his chair. "This can't be real." "It's real, my friend," Marcus said, clapping him on the shoulder. "And it's just the beginning." Underscore. The calls start flooding in by the next morning. Daryl's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Local news stations wanted interviews, philanthropists wanted to donate, and organizations across the country were reaching out to collaborate. Daryl, who had once felt invisible, was now the center of attention. It was overwhelming, but also deeply humbling. Clara helped him sort through the requests. "We need to prioritize. Let's focus on partners who can help us expand or provide long-term support." Daryl nodded. "Agreed. But I want to stay grounded. This can't just be about media attention." Clara smiled. "That's why you're the right person for this. You care about the mission more than the spotlight." As they worked through the list, Daryl's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello? Daryl Monroe?" The voice on the other end was warm and familiar. "Yes, this is Daryl. Hi, this is Oprah Winfrey. I heard your story, and I'd love to feature you on my show." Daryl nearly dropped the phone. Keanu returns a week later. Keanu walked into the center unannounced, wearing his signature baseball cap and black jacket. Daryl spotted him in the lobby and rushed over, grinning. "Did you plan this media explosion?" Daryl asked, half joking. Keanu laughed. "Nope, I don't even have social media. But I heard about it, and I had to come see how you're doing." Daryl led Keanu to the staff lounge, where they sat over cups of coffee. "It's been overwhelming," Daryl admitted. "The support is incredible, but it's a lot to handle." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "I get it. Fame and attention can be tricky. But if anyone can stay grounded through this, it's you." Daryl smiled, his nerves easing. "I just don't want to lose sight of why I started this." "You won't," Keanu assured him. "You've built something real. The media buzz will come and go, but the lives you're changing, that's permanent." They sipped their coffee in comfortable silence before Keanu asked, "What's the next big step?" Daryl thought for a moment. "Expanding to other cities. There's a huge need for centers like this everywhere." Keanu's eyes lit up. "I know some people who could help. Let me make a few calls." "Keanu," Daryl said, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Are you trying to be my full-time guardian angel?" Keanu grinned. "Just paying it forward." A national movement within months. The success of the Daryl Monroe Community Center sparked a national movement. Cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and Boston reached out, eager to replicate the model. Daryl found himself traveling across the country, meeting with mayors and community leaders. Each time, he shared his story, how one moment of kindness had set everything into motion. At a press conference in Chicago, a journalist asked, "Do you think this movement would have happened without Keanu Reeves?" Daryl smiled. "I think kindness always has the potential to create change. But sometimes, you need someone to remind you that you're worth it. Keanu did that for me, and now I'm trying to do that for others." Underscore, 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 for a full circle moment a year later, on a crisp autumn morning, Daryl was walking through Central Park when he noticed a man sitting on a bench, head bowed, clutching a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry and homeless. Anything helps." The scene brought back memories of his own struggles. Without hesitation, Daryl approached the man, sat next to him, and offered a warm smile. "Hey," Daryl said gently. "What's your name?" "James," the man replied, his voice barely audible. Daryl handed him a business card for the center. "I know what you're going through. I've been there, but you're not alone. Come to the center. We'll help you get back on your feet." James's eyes filled with tears as he accepted the card. "Thank you," he whispered. Daryl stood, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. As he walked away, he thought about the ripple that had started on a subway train years ago and how it continued to grow, one act of kindness at a time. Underscore, 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 epilogue. The ripple never ends years later. Daryl's story became the subject of documentaries, books, and university courses on social justice. The network of community centers had expanded to over 20 cities, helping thousands of people rebuild their lives. In a rare interview, Keanu Reeves was asked about the subway encounter that started it all. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," Keanu said with a modest smile. "I just treated someone like a human being." The real story is what Daryl did with that moment. He turned it into something bigger than any of us could have imagined. As the interview ended, Keanu looked directly into the camera. "Kindness is like a spark. You never know how far it'll go." And far it went, lighting up lives, creating change, and proving that even the smallest act of compassion can lead to extraordinary things.